The night Elvis Presley first heard the boy play that broken guitar, the applause of thousands of people was still ringing in his ears. It was December 1956. Elvis was only 21 years old, but his name had already become almost impossible to escape. His records were climbing the charts. His appearances on television had turned him into a sensation. Crowds screamed whenever he walked onto a stage, and newspapers argued about whether he was a genius, a troublemaker, or simply the most dangerous young man America had ever seen with a guitar. But beneath all that noise, Elvis was still a young man from Memphis, who remembered what it felt like to have almost nothing. That was why, on a cold evening just before Christmas, he stopped when a stranger handed him a small envelope. It happened outside a theater after a performance. Elvis had just stepped into the back entrance when a hospital volunteer approached him. "Mr. Presley." Elvis turned. The woman looked nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you." Elvis smiled politely. "You're not bothering me." She held out the envelope. "This is from a boy named Eddie." Elvis looked down at the envelope. There was no expensive paper, no fancy handwriting, just a child's name written carefully across the front. Eddie. Elvis opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was uneven, as though whoever had written it had needed to stop several times. "Dear Elvis, I know you are busy. I don't need a lot of time. I just want you to hear my guitar once." Elvis read the sentence twice. Then he looked at the woman. "How old is he?" 12. Elvis folded the paper slowly. "What kind of guitar?" The woman hesitated. "An old one." Elvis smiled. "That's not really an answer." She looked down. "It's broken." For some reason, that word stayed with him. Broken. Elvis had spent the entire year hearing people talk about records, money, fame, controversy, television appearances, and everything else that came with becoming famous. But this boy hadn't asked for money. He hadn't asked for an autograph. He hadn't asked Elvis to buy him a new guitar. He had simply asked him to hear the broken one. That night, Elvis couldn't stop thinking about it. The following afternoon, Elvis arrived quietly at the hospital. He didn't want reporters. He didn't want cameras. He didn't even tell most of the people around him where he was going. He wore a dark jacket and simple clothes, trying to look like an ordinary young man. But the moment he stepped into the children's ward, one of the nurses recognized him. Her eyes widened. "You're Elvis Presley." Elvis smiled. "That's what they tell me." The nurse laughed softly. Then her expression changed. "Eddie is waiting." Elvis followed her down the hallway. The hospital smelled of medicine and disinfectant. There were Christmas decorations hanging from the walls, but they seemed strangely small against the quietness of the building. When Elvis reached Eddie's room, he stopped at the doorway. The boy was sitting near the window. He was extremely thin. A gray blanket covered his legs. Beside him was an old acoustic guitar. Elvis immediately understood what the nurse had meant. The guitar looked like it had survived a war. The wooden body was cracked in several places. One corner had been repaired with tape. The finish was almost completely gone. The bridge had been glued back together, and only a few strings looked usable. Eddie heard the door open. He turned. For several seconds he simply stared. Then his eyes became enormous. "You're really him." Elvis smiled. "I hope so." Eddie looked toward the guitar. "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't." The boy's face fell. Then Elvis added, "But I changed my mind." Eddie smiled. It was a small smile. But Elvis noticed it immediately. The boy reached for the guitar. "This is my dad's." Elvis looked at the instrument. "Your dad played?" "Sometimes." "What happened to him?" Eddie looked toward the window. He died. The room became quiet. Elvis didn't ask another question. He knew what it meant when someone answered that quickly. After a moment, Eddie touched the damaged side of the guitar. "My dad gave it to me when I was little." Elvis nodded. "So you learned on this?" "Mostly." Eddie picked it up. His hands trembled. Elvis noticed. "Nervous?" "A little." "You don't have to be." Eddie looked at him. "Yes, I do." Elvis laughed. "Why?" "Because you're Elvis Presley." Elvis leaned back in the chair. "Well, you're Eddie." The boy smiled. "And you're the one with the guitar." That made Elvis laugh again. For the first time that afternoon, the room felt lighter. Then Eddie placed his fingers on the strings. "I want to play something." Elvis nodded. "Go ahead," Eddie began. The first chord sounded weak. The second string buzzed. One note didn't sound at all. Eddie stopped. "Sorry." Elvis immediately shook his head. "Don't apologize." Eddie tried again. This time, the melody became recognizable. It was "Love Me Tender." Elvis's expression changed. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened. The boy's version was nothing like the polished recordings playing on radios across America. There were pauses, wrong notes, buzzing strings, moments when Eddie had to stop because his hands were shaking too badly. But he kept going. And Elvis kept listening. Outside the room, the nurse stood silently. She had seen children in pain before. She had seen parents cry. She had seen famous people visit hospitals and leave quickly. But she had never seen anyone listen to a child the way Elvis was listening now. Eddie reached the final line. His fingers slipped. The final chord barely made a sound. He lowered the guitar. "I messed it up." Elvis looked at him. "No." Eddie looked confused. "You did not mess it up." "But the guitar." Elvis leaned forward. "The guitar is doing exactly what it's supposed to do." Eddie frowned. "What?" "It's telling the truth." The boy stared at him. Elvis pointed toward the guitar. "That guitar has been through something. So have you." Eddie looked down. Neither of them spoke. Then Elvis quietly asked, "Why did you want me to hear it?" Eddie swallowed. His voice became softer. "Because—" He stopped. Elvis waited. "Because I don't know how much longer I get to play it." The words hit Elvis harder than any scream from a stadium audience ever had. He looked at the boy, then at the guitar, then back at Eddie. "Who told you that?" "The doctors." Elvis's eyes lowered. Eddie continued, "They don't say it directly. Adults think kids don't understand." He gave a weak smile. "But we do." Elvis didn't know what to say. For once, the man who could make an entire stadium scream had no words. If you're listening right now, I want you to pause for just a moment and imagine this scene. A 21-year-old Elvis Presley, surrounded by fame, money, screaming fans, and cameras. And across from him sits a 12-year-old boy who doesn't want any of those things. He only wants someone to hear him play one last song. Quick poll. If you were Elvis in that room, what would you do? A. Buy Eddie a brand new guitar. B. Sit beside him and play the broken guitar together. C. Bring Eddie to a live Elvis concert. D. Something completely different. Tell me your answer in the comments. And if stories like this keep you listening, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. I'd love to know whether you're listening from Memphis, Nashville, London, New York, or somewhere on the other side of the world. Because what happened next would change Elvis's memory of that little broken guitar forever. Elvis stood slowly. "Let me see it." Eddie handed him the instrument. Elvis turned it over carefully. He examined the cracks, the worn wood, the repaired bridge, the scratches along the body. Then he looked inside the sound hole. There was something written there in faded pencil. Eddie noticed Elvis staring. "What does it say?" Elvis turned the guitar slightly toward the light. 3 words were barely visible. "For my son." Elvis froze. Eddie hadn't mentioned those words. "Did your father write this?" Eddie nodded. "He wrote it before he got sick." Elvis ran his fingers gently across the letters. For a moment, he wasn't a famous singer. He was just a 21-year-old boy thinking about family, thinking about his own parents, thinking about his mother, thinking about how quickly life could change. He handed the guitar back. Then Eddie said something that Elvis would remember for the rest of his life. "My dad used to say a guitar doesn't have to be perfect." Elvis looked at him. What did he mean? Eddie smiled. He said, "If you have something to say, people will listen." Elvis looked down. A tear appeared in the corner of his eye. He quickly wiped it away. Eddie noticed. "You're crying." Elvis laughed quietly. "No, I'm not." "You are." "Maybe it's the hospital air." Eddie smiled. "You're a terrible liar." Elvis laughed. And then, for a few seconds, the two of them simply sat there. No cameras, no screaming fans, no stage, no spotlight, just a young singer and a dying boy beside a broken guitar. Then Elvis picked up the instrument again. He looked at Eddie. "You taught yourself?" "Mostly." "Then teach me." Eddie's eyes widened. "What?" "You heard me. But you're Elvis Presley. And you're Eddie." Elvis handed him the guitar. "So, teach me how you play it." Eddie smiled. And for the next hour, something extraordinary happened. The famous singer became the student. The sick boy became the teacher. And the broken guitar became the bridge between them. But neither of them knew that Eddie had one more request. A request that would force Elvis to make a decision no one around him expected. And when Elvis finally heard it, he would have to decide whether fame was worth anything at all if it couldn't be used to help someone who had nothing left to lose. The answer would come the following morning. Next morning, Elvis woke up with Eddie's words still in his head. A guitar doesn't have to be perfect. If you have something to say, people will listen. He had heard thousands of opinions about music. Producers had told him what songs to record. Managers had told him what clothes to wear. Television executives had told him how long he should stay on camera. Critics had told him what kind of singer they thought he was. But nobody had ever explained music to him in such a simple way. Eddie had. And Elvis couldn't forget it. Before leaving the hospital the previous evening, Eddie had made one final request. "Come back tomorrow." Elvis had smiled. "I will." Eddie had looked at him suspiciously. "You promise?" Elvis nodded. "I promise." So the next morning, Elvis returned. But this time, he didn't come alone. He carried something under his arm. When Eddie saw him enter the room, his face immediately brightened. "You came back." "I told you I would." "What did you bring?" Elvis placed the object carefully on the chair. Eddie's eyes widened. It was a new guitar case. Eddie stared at it. "You didn't." Elvis opened the case. Inside was a beautiful new acoustic guitar. The wood was polished. The strings were perfect. There wasn't a single crack. Eddie looked at it for several seconds. Then he looked at Elvis. "It's beautiful," Elvis smiled. "I thought you might need one." Eddie touched the guitar gently. Then he slowly pushed it away. Elvis was surprised. "You don't like it?" "I love it." "Then what's wrong?" Eddie looked toward the old guitar sitting beside the bed. "I don't want to replace Dad's guitar." Elvis understood immediately. The new guitar wasn't the problem. The memories were. Eddie reached for the damaged instrument. This one sounds like him. Elvis sat beside him. Then keep it. Eddie smiled. But I'll never be able to play it like you. Elvis shook his head. That's not the point. What is? Making it yours. Eddie looked at him. Elvis took the broken guitar and placed it between them. Your father gave you this guitar. Now you have to give it your own story. Eddie's eyes filled with tears. He nodded. That afternoon, Elvis stayed far longer than anyone expected. He didn't just talk to Eddie. He played with him. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes Eddie couldn't play because he was too tired. Sometimes Elvis simply sat quietly beside the bed. At one point, Eddie asked, "Do you ever get tired of people screaming your name?" Elvis laughed. All the time. Then why do you do it? Elvis thought for a moment. Because when I'm singing, I feel like I'm talking to people. Eddie looked at him. But there are thousands of people. Sometimes, Elvis said, you can sing for 10,000 people and still feel like nobody heard you. Eddie smiled. I heard you. Elvis looked at him. Those 3 words meant more than Eddie could understand. Later that evening, Elvis received a phone call. It was from his manager. He had a television appearance coming up. There were rehearsals, meetings, publicity, a growing list of obligations. Elvis listened quietly. Then he looked at Eddie. The boy was asleep. The broken guitar rested beside him. I'll be there, Elvis finally said. He hung up. The nurse approached. You don't have to stay. Elvis looked at Eddie. I know. Then why are you still here? Elvis smiled faintly. Because I said I would come back. The nurse nodded. Then she said something that changed the mood completely. His condition got worse this afternoon. Elvis's smile disappeared. How much worse? The nurse hesitated. We don't know. What does that mean? It means we should prepare for anything. Elvis looked at Eddie again. For the first time, the possibility became real. He might not have much time. And suddenly, Elvis remembered his promise. Come back tomorrow. What if tomorrow wasn't guaranteed? The following day, Elvis arrived before sunrise. The hospital was almost completely silent. He walked down the hallway carrying the old guitar. But when he reached Eddie's room, he stopped. The bed was empty. Elvis's heart dropped. He immediately turned toward the nurse's station. Where's Eddie? The nurse looked at him. He's in surgery. Surgery? She nodded. His condition changed during the night. Elvis stood frozen. Is he going to be okay? The nurse didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, We're hoping. Elvis looked through the small window in the door. There was nobody inside. He placed the guitar against the wall. Then he sat down. For the first time in months, Elvis didn't care about his schedule. He didn't care about the next performance. He didn't care about television. He only wanted to know whether a 12-year-old boy would wake up. Minutes became hours. Elvis remained in the hallway. A doctor eventually came through the doors. Elvis stood immediately. How is he? The doctor looked exhausted. He made it through. Elvis closed his eyes. Relief washed over his face. But he's very weak. Can I see him? The doctor hesitated. Briefly. Elvis nodded. He entered the room. Eddie looked smaller than before. His eyes opened slowly. When he saw Elvis, he whispered, You came. Elvis smiled. I told you. Eddie looked toward the guitar. You brought it. Of course. Eddie smiled weakly. Can we play? Elvis looked at the doctor. The doctor gave a small nod. So Elvis sat beside the bed. Eddie placed his trembling fingers on the strings, but he couldn't play. His hands were too weak. Elvis gently placed his own hand over Eddie's. That's okay. I can't. You don't have to. But I promised. Elvis shook his head. No. He looked directly into Eddie's eyes. You already gave me the song. Eddie's eyes filled with tears. Then Elvis picked up the guitar. He played the opening chords of Love Me Tender. Slowly, quietly, without an audience. Eddie closed his eyes. For a few moments, the hospital room disappeared. There were no machines, no doctors, no fear, only music. If you're still listening, here's another question for you. What do you think Elvis should do now? A. Use his fame to raise money for Eddie's treatment. B. Invite Eddie to meet Elvis's entire band. C. Keep the promise private and simply stay beside him. D. Take Eddie's story to television so millions can hear it. Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story is touching your heart, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from. Your comment might come from a small town, a big city, or another country entirely. We want to know where this story is reaching you. Because Elvis was about to make a decision that would surprise everyone around him. The next morning, Elvis walked into a meeting with his manager. There were papers everywhere. Contracts, schedules, television appearances, newspaper requests, concert plans. His manager looked up. You're late, Elvis sat down. I was at the hospital. His manager sighed. Elvis, I understand, but you've got commitments. I know. You can't keep disappearing. Elvis stared at him. Then he said, I need you to cancel tomorrow's appearance. The room became silent. Cancel? Yes. You can't be serious. I am. Do you understand how much that appearance is worth? Elvis didn't answer. His manager continued. This is your biggest year. Elvis looked toward the window. Then he quietly said, There's a 12-year-old boy in a hospital who thinks he won't live long enough to hear another song. His manager stopped talking. Elvis continued, I don't know if I can change what happens to him. He looked down at his hands. But I can make sure he doesn't feel forgotten. The manager leaned back. For once, he had no argument. That evening, Elvis returned to the hospital. But this time, something was different. There were reporters outside. Someone had discovered that Elvis had been visiting Eddie. Cameras were waiting. People wanted a story. The hospital staff tried to keep them away. Elvis walked through the crowd without saying a word. A reporter shouted, Elvis, is it true you're helping a dying boy? Another shouted, Are you going to pay for his treatment? A third asked, Is this publicity? Elvis stopped. He turned around. For several seconds, he looked at the reporters. Then he said, Some things aren't publicity, and walked inside. Those 5 words would be repeated in newspapers the next morning. But Elvis didn't care. He went straight to Eddie's room. The boy was awake, and sitting beside his bed was the brand-new guitar. Eddie smiled. I changed my mind. Elvis raised an eyebrow. About what? I want to learn on both. Elvis smiled. That's my boy. Eddie looked at him. But I still want the broken one. Why? Because it brought you to me. Elvis couldn't answer. He simply sat down. Then Eddie whispered, There's something else I need to tell you. Elvis leaned closer. What is it? Eddie looked toward the door. My mother doesn't know. Doesn't know what? Eddie swallowed. I asked the doctors not to tell her how bad it is. Elvis's expression changed. Why? Because she already lost Dad. His voice trembled. I don't want her to be scared again. Elvis stared at the boy. Then Eddie reached for his hand. I need you to promise me something. What? If something happens... He paused. If I don't get better... Elvis's eyes filled with tears. Don't talk like that. But I need you to promise. Elvis looked away. Eddie squeezed his hand. Promise me you'll play this guitar again. Elvis looked at the broken instrument, then back at the boy. Finally, he nodded. I promise. Neither of them knew that the next few days would bring the most painful moment of their entire friendship, because Eddie's condition was about to change again. And this time, Elvis wouldn't be able to hide his tears. For the next 3 days, Elvis kept his promise. Every afternoon, no matter how crowded his schedule became, he returned to the hospital. Sometimes he stayed for 10 minutes. Sometimes he stayed for hours. And every time he entered Eddie's room, the boy would look toward the door and ask the same question. You came back. Elvis always gave him the same answer. I told you I would. But by the 4th day, something had changed. Eddie was no longer sitting by the window. He was lying in bed. The broken guitar rested against the wall. The new guitar remained untouched in its case. Elvis walked into the room carrying 2 cups of milk. One for you. Eddie smiled weakly. You remembered. I remember everything. Eddie took the cup with both hands. Then he looked at Elvis. Did you play last night? Yes. Were people screaming? Elvis laughed. Very loudly. Did you like it? Elvis thought about the question. I did. Eddie nodded. Then he asked, Did you think about me? Elvis stopped. Yes. How much? Elvis smiled. More than you know. Eddie looked toward the window. Then I guess I was there. Elvis sat beside him. You were. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Eddie asked, Can you tell me something? Sure. What was it like before you were famous? Elvis leaned back. That question took him somewhere else. Back to Memphis. Back to a small house. Back to his mother. Back to the days when he had more dreams than money. It was different, he said. How? I was just a kid who wanted to sing. Were you scared? All the time. Of what? Failing. Eddie looked surprised. You? Elvis smiled. Especially me. Why? Because when people expect something from you, you're afraid you won't be good enough. Eddie looked at his damaged guitar. Like me. Elvis shook his head. No. He leaned closer. Like me. That conversation stayed with Elvis long after he left. That night, he returned home and couldn't sleep. He walked through the quiet room and saw his own guitars standing nearby. Beautiful instruments. Expensive instruments. Perfectly maintained. He stared at them. Then he thought about Eddie's guitar, the cracked wood, the broken bridge, the faded writing. For my son Elvis sat down. He picked up one of his own guitars. He played a few notes. They sounded perfect. But somehow, that perfection bothered him. He stopped. He remembered Eddie saying, This one sounds like him. Elvis lowered the guitar. Maybe Eddie was right. Maybe music wasn't supposed to be perfect. Maybe the scratches were part of the song. Maybe the broken places were what made the instrument worth remembering. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Elvis received a letter. It wasn't from a fan. It wasn't from a reporter. It was from Eddie's mother. She thanked him for visiting her son. But there was another sentence that made Elvis stop reading. Eddie has never been this happy since his father died. Elvis folded the letter carefully. Then he read it again. For the first time, he realized something. He hadn't saved Eddie. He hadn't cured him. He hadn't changed the diagnosis. But he had given the boy something doctors couldn't prescribe. A reason to look forward to tomorrow. And sometimes, Elvis realized, that might be just as important. That afternoon, Elvis arrived at the hospital carrying a small box. Eddie was awake. What is that? Elvis put it on the table. Open it. Eddie slowly opened the box. Inside was a photograph. It showed Elvis holding the broken guitar. Eddie stared at it. You took this? Someone did. Eddie smiled. Can I keep it? It's yours. Eddie turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back. He read it aloud. To Eddie, keep playing. His eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Elvis nodded. Then Eddie pointed toward the guitar. Can we play? Absolutely. Eddie picked up the old instrument. Elvis sat beside him. This time they didn't play Love Me Tender immediately. Eddie started with a simple melody his father had taught him. Elvis listened carefully. What song is that? I don't know. You don't know? My dad never told me the name. Elvis smiled. And maybe you should give it one. Eddie thought. What should I call it? Elvis looked at him. You choose? Eddie stared at the strings. After several seconds, he whispered, Tomorrow. Elvis smiled. That's a good name. And they played it together. A melody without a title. A song created by a boy who wasn't sure how many tomorrows he had left. If you're still with me, here's today's question. Imagine you're Eddie. You have your father's broken guitar, a new guitar from Elvis, and one chance to leave something behind. What would you do? A. Write your own song. B. Give the broken guitar to Elvis. C. Ask Elvis to record one final song with you. D. Keep the guitar for your family. Tell me your choice in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from. We read those comments, and it's incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's return to Eddie. Because the next morning, Elvis received a phone call that made his heart stop. The hospital nurse was crying. Elvis? Yes? It's Eddie. Elvis stood immediately. What happened? He's having trouble breathing. I'll be there. Mr. Presley. What? You should come now. Elvis didn't ask another question. He grabbed his coat and left. When he arrived at the hospital, the hallway was crowded with doctors and nurses. He saw Eddie's mother standing outside the room. She was crying. Elvis walked toward her. How is he? She shook her head. I don't know. Elvis placed his hand gently on her shoulder. I'm here. She looked at him. You don't have to be. I know. She began crying harder. He loves you. Elvis swallowed. I love him too. Then the doctor came out. He's asking for you. Elvis entered the room. Eddie was barely conscious. His breathing was shallow. His eyes opened slightly. When he saw Elvis, he smiled. You came. Elvis sat beside him. Of course. Eddie looked toward the guitar. Is it there? Elvis turned. The broken guitar was lying against the wall. I brought it. Eddie nodded. Good. Elvis picked it up. Do you want to play? Eddie's eyes filled with tears. I don't think I can. Elvis sat closer. Then I'll play. He began softly. The same melody. Tomorrow. Eddie listened, his eyes closed. Elvis kept playing. His fingers moved slowly across the strings. Then Eddie whispered, Keep going. So Elvis kept going. The room was silent except for the guitar. A nurse stood in the doorway. Eddie's mother covered her mouth. Elvis continued playing. Then Eddie opened his eyes. Can I tell you something? Elvis stopped playing. Anything. I was scared when I met you. Elvis smiled through tears. I know. I thought you'd be like the people on television. What people? People who smile for cameras. Elvis laughed softly. I do smile for cameras. Eddie smiled. But you're different here. Elvis's eyes filled again. Different how? You listen. Elvis looked down. That word broke something inside him, because he suddenly understood what Eddie had given him. Not a song, not a story, not even a memory. He had given Elvis a reminder that fame meant nothing if you stopped listening to people. Hours passed. Eddie's condition stabilized. The doctors said he had survived another crisis, but they couldn't promise how long the improvement would last. Elvis refused to leave. He slept in a chair beside the bed. When he woke, Eddie was watching him. "You snore." Elvis opened one eye. "I do not." "You do." "That's impossible." Eddie smiled. "You're famous for it now." Elvis laughed. For a moment, everything felt normal. But then Eddie asked, "Do you think I'll ever see you perform?" Elvis looked at him. "Yes," Eddie smiled. "Really?" "Yes." "When?" Elvis hesitated. Then he made a decision. "Tomorrow night." Eddie's eyes widened. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow." "But I can't leave the hospital." "You don't have to." "What do you mean?" Elvis leaned closer. "I'll bring the show to you." Eddie laughed. "You can't bring thousands of people here." "I don't need thousands." "How many?" Elvis looked at him. "Just you." The next day, Elvis made arrangements that no one expected. He couldn't bring a full concert into the hospital, but he could bring something smaller: a guitar, a few musicians, and a private performance. No cameras, no reporters, no publicity, just music. When the hospital staff heard about it, they agreed to let Elvis use a quiet room at the end of the children's ward. A few nurses gathered. Eddie's mother stood near the door, and Eddie was brought into the room in a wheelchair. He looked around. There was a microphone, a chair, a few musicians, and Elvis standing in the center. Eddie smiled. "You actually did it." Elvis smiled back. "I told you." Then Elvis picked up his guitar. But before he began, he looked at Eddie. "You requested a concert." Eddie laughed. "I did." "So you get to choose the first song." Eddie thought for a moment. Then he pointed toward the broken guitar. "That one." Elvis nodded. He understood immediately. So he sat beside Eddie, and together they began to play. "Love Me Tender." Slowly, softly, beautifully. For the first time, Eddie's broken guitar didn't sound broken. It sounded alive. And when they reached the final note, the room remained silent. No applause, no screaming, just tears. Then Eddie whispered, "That was perfect." Elvis shook his head. "No," he smiled. "That was yours." But as the nurses began quietly applauding, Elvis noticed something. Eddie's mother had turned away. She was crying. And in that moment, Elvis realized why. Because the song wasn't only a performance. It was a goodbye that nobody was ready to say. And before the night was over, Eddie would hand Elvis the broken guitar and make him a promise that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The room remained silent after the final note faded away. No one wanted to speak first. The nurses wiped tears from their eyes. Eddie's mother stood near the wall, holding her hands together, and Elvis looked at the boy beside him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Eddie slowly reached for the broken guitar. The old wood was scratched. The body was cracked. The strings buzzed when touched. Yet, somehow, it had become the most important guitar Elvis had ever held. Eddie carefully lifted it and placed it in Elvis's hands. "Elvis?" "Yeah, buddy." "I want you to keep it." Elvis immediately shook his head. "No." Eddie smiled. "Yes. This belongs to you." Eddie looked at the guitar. "It belonged to my dad." His voice became softer. "Then it belonged to me." Elvis swallowed hard. "And now?" Eddie looked directly at him. "Now it belongs to the person who listened." For a second, Elvis couldn't speak. He had performed before kings, celebrities, politicians, and crowds of thousands. But no compliment had ever touched him like those words. He stared at the guitar, then at Eddie. "I can't take this." "You have to." "Why?" Eddie smiled. "Because someday, somebody else is going to need you the way I did." The room became completely silent. Even the nurses stopped moving. Eddie continued, "When that happens, I want you to remember me." Elvis felt tears running down his face. This time, he didn't try to hide them. He simply nodded. "I'll remember." "Promise?" "I promise." A few days later, Elvis was preparing for another performance. The venue was packed. Thousands of fans filled every seat. Backstage, assistants rushed around. Managers reviewed schedules. Reporters waited outside. Everything looked normal. But Elvis wasn't thinking about the show. He was thinking about a hospital room, about a 12-year-old boy, about a broken guitar. Just before he walked onto the stage, a nurse arrived carrying a small envelope. Elvis recognized her immediately. His heart sank. The nurse didn't need to say anything. He already knew. Slowly, she handed him the envelope. Inside was a note. It was written in Eddie's handwriting. The words were shaky but clear. "Dear Elvis, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't stay. Don't be sad. You already gave me the best concert of my life. Keep playing, and don't forget to listen. Your friend." Eddie Elvis closed his eyes. For several seconds, he stood completely still. Then he folded the note and placed it inside his jacket pocket, right over his heart. Before we reach the end of this story, here's one final question. What do you think was Eddie's greatest gift to Elvis? A, the broken guitar. B, his friendship. C, the reminder to listen to people. D, the courage he showed until the end. Write your answer in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see listeners joining from different cities, countries, and corners of the world. A few minutes later, Elvis walked onto the stage. The audience exploded with applause. Thousands of people stood and cheered. But before singing his first song, Elvis did something unusual. He walked to the center of the stage carrying a different guitar. Not his newest one. Not his most expensive one. Not the one that sounded perfect. He carried Eddie's broken guitar. The crowd looked confused. Elvis sat down. He adjusted the instrument carefully. Then he spoke into the microphone. "Tonight, I'd like to play for a friend." The arena became quiet. No further explanation. No dramatic speech. Just those words. A friend. Then Elvis began playing. The old guitar buzzed. A string rattled. The sound wasn't perfect. But for the first time, Elvis didn't care. Because he finally understood what Eddie's father had meant. A guitar didn't have to be perfect. It only had to tell the truth. And that night, every note carried the truth of a young boy who had faced fear with courage, pain with grace, and sadness with music. When the song ended, thousands of people stood. The applause lasted for several minutes, but Elvis wasn't listening to the crowd. In his mind, he could still see a hospital room, a wheelchair by the window, a cracked guitar, and a smiling boy saying, "Now it belongs to the person who listened." Years later, long after records had been broken and concerts had ended, Elvis would still keep that guitar. Not because it was valuable, not because it was famous, but because it reminded him of something far more important than fame. That sometimes the greatest performances happen far away from any stage, and sometimes the people who change our lives the most are the ones the world barely notices. The broken guitar remained with him. The memory remained with him. And so did the promise to keep playing, to keep caring, and above all, to keep listening.